She thought her life was just ordinary routine. But one little thing changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments what you would do in her place. It's really important for the channel. My name is Sarah, and on the surface, my life isn't any different from hundreds of others in suburban Georgia. School, household chores, and rare outings with friends. Everything seemed familiar and calm. But near me was my stepfather, a man who always kept a little distance, and at the same time, his presence was felt in every little thing. His gaze lingered longer than it should. His words sounded softer than simple domestic concern, and the silence between us became more and more strained. Do you want me to continue the story for you? Keeping this same style of intrigue and tension? I tried not to pay attention to these little things, but they seemed to accumulate day after day. In the morning, he was always the first to go to the kitchen, turn on the kettle, and leave a mug of hot tea for me. Sometimes I would wake up a little earlier and see him do it. Calmly, as if it were routine, but with a special kind of attentiveness. In the evening, when we had dinner together, he would ask about my day, and in his voice, I heard an interest I hadn't noticed from anyone else. Sometimes we'd watch movies. I'd be on the couch with a blanket, and he'd be in the armchair opposite. But gradually, I found myself waiting for the moment he would come closer to adjust the blanket or hand me a mug of tea. His gestures were simple, domestic, but there was always something else hidden in them, something that made me feel uneasy inside. And the strangest thing was his gaze, calm and confident, but too intent for me to remain indifferent. One day, I came home earlier than usual. The apartment was quiet. Only the clatter of dishes could be heard from the kitchen. He was standing at the stove making dinner, and for a moment, it seemed to me that it wasn't my stepfather at all, but someone closer than I could allow myself to imagine. He turned around, noticed me, and smiled calmly. But in that smile, there was something that knocked the ground out from under my feet. "You're home early today?" His voice was familiar, ordinary, but I caught a hint of warmth in it that was hard to call a coincidence. I nodded and walked closer, helping to set out the plates. Our hands reached for the same spoon almost simultaneously, and when our fingers touched, I flinched. He also paused his movement and didn't pull his hand away right away, and a silence hung in the room, too thick for a simple dinner. I quickly stepped back, but inside my heart was beating so fast it felt like he could hear every beat. I pretended to be busy with small things, pulling out napkins and setting down glasses, just to hide the trembling in my hands. But I could feel his gaze, calm and persistent, as if he saw more than I wanted to show. We sat down to eat, and our usual conversations about work and errands seemed strained, as if something we were both silent about was hidden behind every word. When I reached for the bread, he handed it to me first. His fingers touched mine again, this time for longer than a coincidence would allow. I looked up and met his gaze. There was no rush or playfulness in it, just a seriousness that made it hard to breathe. I looked away, but the feeling didn't disappear. It settled deep inside, and now even the simplest moments, dinner, conversation, a sluchajny touch, became too significant. After dinner, I collected the plates and went to the kitchen just to distract myself, but he followed. We stood next to each other. I washed the dishes and he wiped the clean plates. It seemed like an ordinary moment, nothing special. But in the silence, his every step and every movement felt too close. Suddenly, he stopped, took a plate from me, and our hands touched again. I looked up and he was right next to me. There were no words in his gaze, but I clearly read that he felt this invisible connection too. My heart started beating faster. I quickly returned my gaze to the water, but inside, everything was already different. We didn't say anything, just continued our routine tasks. But it was in this silence that the strongest intrigue was born. The feeling that something had already changed, and now every morning and every evening would be filled with hidden tension. Later, when everything was put away, I went to my room, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark and heard him walking around the apartment, now in the living room, now in the kitchen. His every step resonated inside me, as if we were connected by an invisible thread. I closed my eyes, but his gaze, his closeness, that moment by the stove when the world seemed to stop, came back to my mind again and again. Unable to bear it, I went out for a glass of water. The light in the living room was still on, and he was sitting in the armchair with a book in his hands. When I walked in, he looked up as if he had been waiting for me. No words, just a silence in which I felt that these were the most dangerous moments. I took a step toward the kitchen, but he said calmly, "Can't sleep." His voice was quiet and familiar, yet it held that same quality that made me feel hot inside. I nodded, and our eyes met again. And in that moment, I understood that we both knew perfectly well what was happening between us, but no one dared to say it. I pretended to drink water, though my hands were shaking so much the glass almost slipped. He was still looking at me over his book, calmly and attentively, as if studying every detail of my state. The silence stretched on, and I felt I couldn't bear it any longer. "Yeah, can't sleep," I exhaled, trying to speak evenly. He closed the book and placed it on the table next to him. His movement was slow and confident, and it conveyed more than just pre-sleep tiredness. "It happens," he replied. But there was something else in his voice, a nuance I couldn't explain. I was about to leave, but he stood up. His steps were unhurried, yet my heart was racing as if he had closed a whole chasm between us. We were too close, and for a split second it seemed like the air around us had become heavier. I looked away, but I could feel the tension filling the space between us. He stopped right next to me, so close I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the warmth of his skin. My heart was pounding so loudly that it felt like he could hear every beat. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it made me shiver even more. "You should really get some rest. It's going to be a long day tomorrow." I nodded, but my legs felt like they wouldn't obey, and I couldn't just leave. We froze, each in our own silence, and that brief moment was more eloquent than any words. His gaze lingered on me a little longer than simple care would allow. I felt everything inside me turn over with the realization that it was in such mundane moments that the thing that scared me and simultaneously drew me in most was hiding. I finally took a step toward my room, but I knew the intrigue was only growing stronger, and it was impossible to avoid it now. In my room, I closed the door but hesitated for a long time before turning off the light. His words, his gaze, that moment when we were so close still swirled in my head. I lay down on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. It felt as if the walls held the silence that had hung between us, and it was heavier than any thoughts. I heard him walk down the hallway and stop by my door. His steps were quiet, as if he himself didn't know why he stopped. My heart froze and my breathing became shallow. I lay still, listening, feeling his presence on the other side. A few seconds later, he walked on. But those seconds were enough to turn everything inside me upside down. I realized that the ordinary domestic trifles no longer concealed the main thing. An invisible line stretched between us, and every day, every encounter in the hallway or at the table, made it more and more obvious. The next morning, I tried to act as usual, but in every movement, I felt his presence more strongly than before. He was already in the kitchen when I woke up, setting the kettle on, and arranging bread and cheese as if he was specifically waiting for me to come out. "Good morning," he said calmly, even too calmly, and his eyes lingered on me a little longer than they should. I answered with a short morning and sat down at the table. He poured me tea and placed the mug next to me, and this gesture, so simple and familiar, suddenly felt too personal. Our fingers touched again, and I felt my heart make a sharp leap. We ate in silence, but the silence wasn't empty. It hid a tension that was becoming more and more palpable. I found myself unable to drink my tea calmly when I felt his gaze, even if it wasn't direct, but always somewhere nearby. And in that moment, I understood that the most ordinary morning and the most familiar breakfast were no longer the same. Our routine was turning into a game where every detail and every look carried more than we could admit out loud. After breakfast, I went back to my room but couldn't find anything to do for a long time. It seemed like everything around me spoke of him. The cup he had given me, the chair he had sat in across from me. Even when I walked past the mirror, I caught my reflection and wondered, is this just my imagination? Or does he feel the same way? In the evening, we met again in the living room. He was fixing an old wall lamp, and I settled on the couch with my laptop. We barely talked, only occasionally exchanging short phrases. But every time he leaned closer to the table with his tools, I smelled his scent, and it distracted me. At one point, he got up and came over to check the outlet next to the couch. His hand was just a few inches from mine, and a new wave of tension washed over me. I involuntarily held my breath, and he, as if sensing it, looked up. Our gazes met so closely that for a second it seemed that if either of us took one more step, the boundary would be completely broken. I quickly lowered my eyes, pretending to be focused on the screen. But inside, everything was boiling with the realization that our ordinary life was becoming quite extraordinary. He lingered by the couch for a little longer than necessary, as if he wasn't checking the outlet, but me. I could feel his breath, and because of it, even the familiar light in the room seemed different, too bright, too revealing. At that moment he said quietly, "It works," and turned off the tool. I nodded, trying to look calm, but my heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he'd hear. He sat back in the armchair and picked up a magazine, but I knew he was watching me, even when he was pretending to read. The minutes dragged on slowly, and the silence became almost unbearable. I closed my laptop, about to go to my room, but he looked up and stopped me with a short phrase. "It's late. Don't strain yourself." The simple words, spoken in a level tone, suddenly sounded different. Too soft, too personal. I froze by the door, met his gaze, and understood that in these quiet evenings and domestic phrases, there was much more hidden than we were willing to admit. I returned to the couch, pretending I just wanted to finish my tea. He lowered his eyes to the magazine again, but I could clearly see it was just a mask behind which he was hiding the same tension I felt. His fingers lazily flipped pages, and his gaze kept returning to me, and each time our eyes met, the air in the room became heavier. I gripped the mug in my hands to keep myself busy, but the warmth of the glass only highlighted the heat inside me. It seemed like nothing was happening. An ordinary evening, two people in one room. But I felt that every word, every gesture, even his silence was becoming part of something bigger. Suddenly, he got up and came closer to take the empty plate from the table next to me. His hand passed just a few inches from mine, and I involuntarily held my breath. He caught it, and a slight, almost imperceptible smile crossed his face, a sign that he understood too. I didn't say a word, but inside, I knew that now the simple silence between us meant much more than a whole conversation. He took the plate to the kitchen but came back almost immediately, as if he hadn't intended to leave me alone for long. I pretended to continue drinking my tea, although the mug had long since gone cold. He sat back in the armchair, but this time he didn't open the magazine. He just placed it on the armrest and looked directly at me. This gaze lasted only a few seconds, but I felt as if it had stripped away all my masks, all my attempts to appear calm. I looked away, but it was too late. More was said in the silence than any words could convey. "Tired?" he asked. His voice was soft, but a hidden strength was felt in it. Hum. I exhaled, trying not to let the tremor in my voice show. He nodded slightly but didn't look away, and that simple movement made everything inside me tense up. I got up, deciding to go to my room, but as I passed him, I suddenly felt his hand touch my elbow almost imperceptibly. The touch was light and fleeting, but it had more meaning than a whole conversation. I stopped, my heart beat faster, and we both knew that the line between ordinary routine and something more had become even thinner. I froze by the armchair, unable to take another step. His hand was still on my elbow, light, almost weightless. But from that touch, a shiver ran through my whole body. The room was silent, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. He looked up, and in that gaze there was no rush or randomness, only confidence in something forbidden but so attractive. "Go get some rest," he said quietly, so that every word resonated inside me. I nodded and took a step toward the door, but as I was leaving, I felt his gaze on me. He didn't hold me back or say another word, but it was in that silence that the main thing was said. We both understood that life would continue just as it had before. Dinners, conversations, the little things of daily life. But now there was a secret between us, invisible and strong, that bound us more tightly than any words. And this intrigue was only just beginning.